So when I play a game I'm interested in, and especially one I plan on doing a video on, I make absolutely certain I don't look at any reviews. I don't want other people to change how I feel about a game. And sometimes my impressions perfectly match the reviews I read, like in the case of God of War. And then other times, I'm completely at odds with them, like AC Origins or Far Cry 5. So I made sure to not look up reviews of Crystal Dynamics' third installment in the Tomb Raider reboot until after I'd finished writing most of this. Here is the Metacritic page for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. That's pretty darn low, actually. And sadly, I might be even lower on this game. I had only recently gotten an Xbox One when I bought the rebooted Tomb Raider Definitive Edition as one of the first 3 games I bought for the system. I'd previously played, disliked, and failed to finish all 3 Uncharted games, but the X1 had a fairly limited library, and Tomb Raider had been reviewed very well. I wasn't expecting all that much when I finally played it, but the game just completely won me over. With beautiful graphics, a surprising amount of characterization, and a story just fun enough to hang very solid gameplay on, the title ended up being one of the year's best for me. Moving on to the second game, Crystal Dynamics took some of the criticism of the first to heart and expanded the maps, gave more tombs and better, although still pretty simple puzzles, while slightly improving on the already very good combat. And so I was saddened to find that the third installment of the franchise is just off. From its levels to its combat, from its story to its performance to its exploration, the one word that kept popping into my mind as I played was just that: off. Something was wrong. This video is going up a bit late because it took me some time to realize what my problem with this game was, and by the end of it, I will replace the word off with another word that I think perfectly encapsulates the problem with Rise of the Definitive Shadow of the Tomb Raider Deluxe Spelunking Edition. After the logo, y'all. A brief history. I don't think it's really possible to talk about the Tomb Raider games without going into their history for at least a little bit. And that's because I think the new game is a victim of what happened to the original franchise. So let's begin by pointing out something that's kinda interesting. Tomb Raider, as a game, became one of the biggest franchises in gaming during one of the most mediocre periods in gaming history. The late 90s and early aughts, or the PlayStation 2 era. It was gaming's awkward teens, long removed from its cute toddler period, and far enough away from the boundless hope and enthusiasm of the 8-bit days, gaming couldn't be called a new medium anymore. This period in gaming was the beginning of the ambitious storytelling and explosive growth in technology. Full 3D graphics and interactive cameras were just being developed, and for the most part, yeah, they were utter dog shit. Games from this era had completely abandoned 8-bit graphics in favor of polygonal rendering, which was going to become a tremendous leap forward very soon, but at the time looked just so bad. This is why no one is making retro games for this period. There's no Binding of Isaac or Dead Cell style games for the PlayStation 2 era, because the gameplay and graphics are the exact same thing we have now, only shittier in literally every single way. So right off the bat, Tomb Raider is kind of the equivalent of the former New York Yankee Kevin Moss in 1992. The most exciting player on a putrid team. Now that doesn't mean those games were bad, and for their time they were obviously somewhat groundbreaking, but there's no arguing that the new Tomb Raider games are superior to the old Tomb Raider games. Tomb Raider was originally developed by British studio Core Design, with pre-production beginning all the way back in 1993. At the time, Core was part of the mightily struggling Eidos. In fact, Tomb Raider quite possibly saved the publisher by being an unexpected smash hit. Such a hit that the game became the rare breakthrough cultural touchstone. Very few games make this leap. Half-Life, absolutely one of the greatest franchises ever and a sales monster, never made its way into mainstream culture like Mario Brothers, Tomb Raider, Halo, etc. You can ask people at work if they've ever heard of Gordon Freeman, and they will stare at you with blank, glassy eyes. Ask them if they heard of Lara Croft, they'll know who you're talking about. Now, according to Wikipedia, Toby Gard was mostly responsible for creating the game and had originally envisioned the player character as a man, until Core's founder worried that it would just be seen as an Indiana Jones knockoff. The character underwent multiple revisions before becoming the absurdly buxom character model that will be played by her human equivalent Angelina Jolie in the movies. For the most part, the games today retain their original setup. Lara explores levels, engaging in combat and extended puzzle sequences. The early games featured more elaborate puzzles and simpler third-person action combat. There was no cover system and it all felt pretty gamey. Lara could do acrobatic backflips while shooting her famous two pistols. Realism was not a goal, as one would expect for a character that's clearly a melding of Indiana Jones and Jessica Rabbit. Another interesting point is that the creator Guard is said to have become more and more disillusioned with the hypersexualization of the character as the time went on. Within a few years, Lara wasn't just a sexy-looking character model, she was a winking, flirting male fantasy run amok. With Eidos needing a continuing infusion of Tomb Raider hits to get their financial house back in order, it fell into a familiar trap. Core was asked to pump out game after game after game. They made 6 of these things in 6 years before finally exhausting themselves so much the lead on the license was moved over to Crystal Dynamics. Now, while the mainline games never devolved into a total mess until their last, the studio is becoming increasingly burnt out and scraping the bottom of the barrel of ideas. If you are needing to release a full, new title every year, and unlike Call of Duty, the same studio is pumping them out, you're not going to have any time to let new ideas percolate. The gameplay stagnated. It lost its reason to exist, with other games taking some of its best features and doing them better. Prince of Persia and the early AC games took the general puzzling third-person action gameplay and improved both the storytelling and added fresh new mechanics. Crystal Dynamics plugged on, making pretty good Tomb Raider games that sold pretty well, but it was increasingly obvious that something needed to change or the franchise would continue its slow slide into irrelevance. Sales continued to slump, and Lara faded from the public consciousness. After 14 grueling years, it was time to pause for a few and update Tomb Raider for the modern market. The games were about to try and take Lara Croft from a cartoon character to an actual person, while also bringing the combat and graphics forward into the new generation. Das Reboot. The Tomb Raider reboot was simultaneously ambitious and extremely safe. Now let me explain that. The game was ambitious in its willingness to totally redesign, desexualize, and humanize its iconic Golden Goose main character. It may not seem it, but it takes some guts to drastically alter a character that has been set in stone for 14 years. A normally proportioned, vulnerable but tough, and utterly ordinary and human Lara is a serious departure from what fans had come to expect. It played it pretty safe in the gameplay it had on offer though. Basically, the first of the reboots is Uncharted, plus Ubisoft, plus Lara Croft. There is, and I think I can say this with confidence really, nothing new or interesting in the design of the gameplay in the reboot. There's nothing in there that's going to surprise a player. There's not one thing that hasn't been done before. But what was there was great because all of its disparate elements were being done very well. Innovation is awesome, but sometimes a formula being done very competently can be just as gratifying. The story in those games isn't groundbreaking, surprising, or particularly compelling, but it's a big step up from the silly nonsense of the previous couple of games. It was well done, well written, well acted. Lara in particular is almost perfectly redesigned and reimagined. She's still very attractive and has sex appeal without being just ridiculous. She's believable and likable. In fact, she's one of the better characters in recent gaming, even if the plot is kind of conventional action movie fluff. The combat, pretty standard third-person action shooter with very light stealth mechanics. There's nothing new or groundbreaking there either, but it's done so very well, with Lara's famous twin 9mm being replaced with an extremely smooth and satisfying to use bow. All the weapons were fun to use. Combat wasn't a boring peek and pop cover shooter, it just felt pretty good to fight things. Platforming, straight up Uncharted, but done better. Controls were fairly tight, and there were far more fail states involved, so it wasn't just the Uncharted thing where it's basically walking except you're on a wall. The big set pieces also clearly inspired by Uncharted, but again, more interactive, and the puzzles were very similar to both classic Tomb Raider, but also the early Assassin's Creed games in that almost all require timing-based platforming and not just the Naughty Dog thing where you stroll about until you figure out which static object the game wants you to interact with before moving on. So while the first two games were fairly derivative, they were also very, very fun, and reviews came in extremely positive. That's not to say that they were perfect though. The first two Tomb Raider games both exemplified and avoided some of the biggest problems with these big budget open world action games. The maps in the first two games were littered with so freaking many collectibles that for someone like me, who is totally incapable of seeing an icon on my map and not going to pick it up, it could really start to drag at times. But the collectibles themselves were usually very cool. Ubisoft cannot help themselves burying you in collectibles, but they are literally nothing more than icons to walk over. Hell, sometimes they're just like pages or music notes, with no narrative attached to it in any way whatsoever. Tomb Raider leaned into its setting to make its collectibles narratively interesting, at least for me. I'm a history nerd, and it's clear a great deal of effort went into making the collectibles in the first two games both interesting and historically relevant. I'm also a paranormal nerd, so the mixture of real-world history and mythological paranormal stuff is right in my wheelhouse. Case in point when talking about the new game. I really like Central and South American pre-colonial stuff. I'm fascinated by alternate theories about Machu Picchu and Uxmal and the legend of Quetzalcoatl. I also love the mystery of the doomed expedition for the mystical lost city that was undertaken by Percy Fawcett. So I got a real kick when I discovered the expedition's notes as text logs here. Fawcett disappeared with his son, Jack, and his friend Raleigh, searching for a lost city of ancients with the magical knowledge that he called City Z. I love Mongol history and tactics, so the last game's description of the Mongol expedition in force into Russia tickled me with its accuracy. Tomb Raider has done those things really well, far better than Uncharted in my opinion. Uncharted's historical and mythological accuracy is more like an Indiana Jones film. History by and for people who really aren't all that into history. Tomb Raider is a video game with the historical backdrop as more than just flavoring. Tomb Raider's history has been a character in the games. As a guy who loves history and the paranormal, it's clear to me that this game was made by people who love history and the paranormal. Let's move on to another little wrinkle that Tomb Raider adds over the Uncharted games to separate itself. Some people gave the first two games shit for having an unnecessary crafting and progression system, but I cannot disagree more. I personally often harp on pointless progression and leveling systems. Destiny 2. And as someone who doesn't like most or really any survival games outside of Subnautica, which I wish would run at more than 4 frames a second, I'm not the kind of guy who likes crafting for its own sake. But when a light crafting system is done correctly, it can be a wonderful way to drive a player towards small goals. Far Cry 3 and 4 used their crafting systems as a way to incentivize hunting dangerous animals. Far Cry 5, for some reason, did away with most of its crafting, and as a result, hunting became literally pointless, which ripped an entire aspect of the gameplay out and replaced it with nothing actually. I mentioned several times now how much I dislike the Uncharted games, but I loved The Last of Us, and the very mild crafting and progression system in that game are actually one of the main reasons that's true. The weapon upgrades gave me a reason to fully explore every part of the map. They provided a way to pace the game beyond the Naughty Dog, shoot things, climb a wall, boost a companion, cutscene, shoot things, climb a wall, boost a companion, cutscene, loop. It wasn't a complex or deep system. It didn't require a bunch of thought or change the gameplay all that much, but it was something else to do. Something with a small but tangible gameplay reward, and one that encouraged exploration while also fitting perfectly into the game's zombie apocalypse scavenging to survive narrative. The first two Tomb Raider games did just this. The crafting fit narratively into the survive in the wild aesthetic. It incentivized thorough exploration of surprisingly dense, vertical, and well-designed levels, and of course, the collectibles had a narrative reason to exist, as Lara is, I guess, kind of, an archaeologist? Deadly archaeologist? On top of all that, the first two games, again, had a lot of combat. With a bevy of weapons and a whole bunch of shooting gallery levels that could be tackled with stealth, or guns, or her very fun-to-use bow. Over time, enemies would respawn, or there would be random patrols, so the larger hub areas that the player had to traverse repeatedly were always alive. Wolves and dangerous wildlife had to be constantly hunted for materials to upgrade your weapons, or simply to clear areas again and again. This meant that though the game suffered from fairly extreme regimentation, it at least constantly mixed its gameplay pieces up enough to never get boring. It struck a safe and good balance between exploring for collectibles, hunting, fighting enemies, story set pieces, stealth sections, and platforming and puzzles. The levels are really well designed and multi-purpose, with all of these different things able to happen on any of the maps outside of the puzzle rooms, which are just puzzle rooms and nothing else. They were wonderfully vertical levels and felt entirely logical. The second game especially features just expertly crafted levels. Everything feels real and lived in and like a place I want to explore. The pacing of the game depended upon making sure that as soon as a player gets bored with one activity, another happens, and for the most part, the pacing of the first two games got this perfectly right. One of the best critiques of the first two games came from Joseph Anderson, who I will link to below. While praising the game in general, he was correct to point out that the rigid separation of its different aspects held the game back from true greatness. He talked about how simply adding combat into the challenge tombs, or having platforming during the combat sequences, would have added much needed gameplay depth. And while that criticism was totally on point and valid, the pacing of the games in general meant that regardless of what the first two games could have been, they were still very, very good games. Their lack of depth and ambition means they weren't all-time classics, but they were rock solid, very fun, excellent value video games. Unfortunately, that's not the case anymore, and to really show you why, we'll have to take a look at a couple of its gameplay elements individually. Combat. Alright, earlier I talked about how surprisingly good Tomb Raider's combat was. It had a nice variety of weapons, an ammo economy that encouraged using everything, and a bow, crafting system, and stealth and melee mechanics that offered a real degree of variety in its otherwise pretty standard third-person cover shooting mechanics. Now, it wasn't perfect. Aiming was pretty wonky in the second game with some kind of weird input lag, but that just kind of made it harder. It was still frenetic and exciting, and it happened all the time. Unlike Uncharted, where you must stand in cover and slowly pop out to shoot dudes before moving on to the next piece of cover, Tomb Raider allowed for a more fun, fluid run-and-gun style. Now, you still have to use cover every so often, but having a healing mechanic and a decent amount of tankiness means that you could run around shooting people and pop into cover to heal up. Or you could play it like a normal cover shooter. Or you could play it like Assassin's Creed with stealth melee kills. Or you could get up high and silently pick people off with your bow. And I need to stress this again, it isn't great combat. It's just very fun, simple combat with more than enough variety and possibilities to always be entertaining. Either way, there was a ton of combat, a great amount of combat variety, and it was very fun combat. Now, for whatever reason, Shadow of the Tomb Raider almost entirely does away with one of the core pillars of its gameplay. There is like no fucking combat in this game. Now, I'm sure you all think I'm exaggerating, but there is so little combat it actually confused me and lulled me into a strange state where I kept waiting for the game to start. So little that after a seemingly endless period of doing almost nothing, I stopped the game to check if there were stats. There were, and after nearly 20 hours of play, I had killed 19 enemies. Granted, I am the kind of dude who has to find every annoying fucking map icon, so your mileage may vary, but the fact that a game would allow me to fight less than one enemy an hour is almost unbelievable. Especially considering I bought this game based upon what the last two games were like. This change leaves me deeply confused. I mentioned earlier about the game's rigid separation of gameplay elements. For all intents and purposes, Tomb Raider's gameplay was split almost evenly between exploration, puzzle platforming, combat, and big set pieces. Those games were so well paced that it felt as if there was a laser precise even split of time. But the new game has drastically cut combat, like drastically cut combat, probably in half, if not more. One of the reasons this is going up so late is because I went back to Rise of the Tomb Raider to see if I was just remembering wrong, and no, there are consistent combat sections after every set piece or bit of exploration. Okay, so realizing this, one would assume that that means they've made a decision to spread that cut time evenly across the other three gameplay pillars. No. There are less of the very well done set piece QTEs that had Lara dodge or shoot things while fleeing. If you played the first game, how many times do you remember doing something like this here? A lot, right? In fact, the helpful video this is used from lets me know that there were 31 minutes of set pieces in the first game. Nothing like this will ever happen in the new one. There are maybe 2 or 3 set pieces, and they boil down to simply running and jumping 2 or 3 times. Okay, I guess if we lost most of the first 2 pillars, we can assume the game has become focused around the puzzles, perhaps making them longer and more complex, as well as providing many, many more of them, right? No. There's just as few actual puzzle tombs, maybe a few more, I guess. I didn't feel like I was doing it any more often. And aside from one that is quite fantastic and probably the best one they've ever done, all of the puzzle rooms are still quite short and may in fact be even simpler than the previous games. Well, shit. That means that all of that gameplay time has been redirected to the only remaining gameplay pillar: walking. What these strange design decisions mean in practice is that a tremendous percentage of your time is spent merely walking around the map picking shit up. with no combat, no hunting, and no set pieces to break them up. You can go from level to level doing nothing but walking and climbing, and the walking and climbing basically boil down to the exact same thing. It's just realizing which direction to push your left analog stick, which isn't really gameplay when there's only one direction the game will let you push your left analog stick. Not only is this by far the least compelling aspect of the gameplay across all of the games, it's the least interactive. This is the part of the gameplay that served as the pacing sections of the first two games. It's what you did in between the combat, set pieces, and puzzles. Generally, after going through those three pillars for a bit, you would be dropped into a new level where you would explore the map for a little while, find some upgrades and historical collectibles, upgrade your weapons, and then get back to the actual gameplay. But for some very strange reason, this is the gameplay in the new Tomb Raider. Now, this is coming out blunter than I'd expected, but there is just no other way to say it. It is really, really boring. The game is completely out of balance in such a way that it almost seems as if the set piece and combat design teams had some kind of catastrophic failure that rendered all their work unusable, but the game still had to ship. And the reason I say that is because the game's progression system apparently didn't get the notice that the gameplay here was going to be based primarily on walking around. Progression. Now, remember earlier when we spoke about crafting and progression in the first two Tomb Raider games? And this is super important because I'm coming to the word that explains the one huge problem with Rise of the Battle of the Planet of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Here's the word. Balance. I'm going to show a couple of screen grabs here. These are the skill trees for the first of the Tomb Raider reboots. And here is the second. The first two games had very small, very simple, very functional skill trees. They weren't really all that important, and so they weren't super complex. Now here's the skill tree for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. You will notice right off the bat that it is a huge and inexplicable mess of a design. One of the very worst UIs I've ever seen. I guess it's cool that it looks like a Mayan calendar, sure, but I can't fucking read this thing. What a fucking mess. Anyway, let's move beyond how fucking dreadful it looks, shall we? Let's get into just how strange and pointless it actually is. A huge portion of these skills are things that simply should not need to be unlocked at all. And another huge portion are completely combat focused in a game with almost no combat at all. Now, I happen to like combat in games, and so I took mostly combat perks. The very first one I took was the ability to shoot 2 and then 3 dudes with my bow and arrow, which was one of the coolest skills in the first game. This allowed you to take out a few guys silently when there was no clear way to kill one without alerting the others. And get this, I'm not kidding, I literally never once used that skill in my entire playthrough of the game. There were only a few times where there were 3 enemies total on the screen. It's almost as if the skill tree was made for the last game before it was inexplicably decided that this game wouldn't really have combat. Likewise, a bunch of the other skills are pretty much pointless. There's a skill that allows Lara to breathe for longer underwater. Why? The swimming sections are so easy they are almost pointless. There are perfectly timed spots to come up for air, meaning the only reason this perk exists is for quality of life, allowing Lara to stay under longer to find a couple more resources. But convenience isn't a good use of skill tree perks, and there's so little combat, you won't really need the resources in this game. The only reason to have a skill tree is if it's going to slowly introduce more complex gameplay systems that need to be learned after others have been mastered. The gameplay of Shadow of the Tomb Raider never changes, even slightly, from your first moment until the final unbelievably terrible boss fight. The skill tree here is completely unnecessary, and spending any development time at all on a system that serves no function is a tragic waste of resources that could have been spent in other places to fix what is a surprisingly unpolished game. It just feels bad. In 2008, Steve Swink wrote a book called Game Feel, a game designer's guide to virtual sensation. That book popularized the term game feel. And here's the thing before we move on. Game feel is, almost by definition, a highly subjective metric. We are talking about an intangible feeling here. It's the kind of thing that's almost impossible to describe, but it's also obvious how important it is, and the different aspects that collude to produce it are pretty well understood now. How precise are the controls? Is there any kind of noticeable lag? Do the animations look fluid? sound design, input method, haptic feedback, all of these contribute to the almost magical and undefinable sensation, which also happens to be basically the most important aspect of any game, especially action games. I spend a ridiculous amount of time bitching about Destiny and praising From Software on this channel, but the fact is this and this feels so damn good. AC Odyssey, which I'm playing now, has a very similar combat system to Dark Souls, but it feels nowhere close to as good. It doesn't feel weighty or precise, it's just lacking something. In my experience, game feel is highly developer dependent. Some studios are just damn good at it, and some are less so. This is one of the first times I've encountered a franchise where the first two games absolutely nailed it, and then this sequel fails so utterly. There are a bunch of problems with Shadow. The collectibles and lore narrative are still pretty damn good, but the actual plot and story is at best adequate. The acting is top notch, but the dialogue is only fine. The skill tree and progressions are pointless. The pacing is almost game-breaking levels of putrid, but there are two things in particular that make Shadow so much less than the last two games that came before it. And I wonder if these two things are mainly a result of a lack of development time. The first of these is the least tangible: game feel. Something feels so very off here. Where the first two games had platforming that was sometimes frustratingly imprecise, it also just felt really good to move Lara around. Her animations were fluid and excellent, and those extremely convincing animations made moving feel good. But this goes far beyond choppier animations. The combat and gunplay feel so bad compared to the first two games. Aiming is sluggish and just feels off. Melee combat, which was shockingly fun in the first two games, is just awful here, with what seems to be a broken auto-targeting system, meaning you can end up swinging wildly as your camera wheels around and repeatedly miss. Lara's jumps are really imprecise. This game seems to want absolutely perfectly timed inputs from you, but doesn't seem to precisely register your input, leaving you insanely frustrated as Lara jumps the wrong direction, killing you, and forcing you to replay the exact same jump over and over and over and over. In every single instance, this game feels worse to play. Something is simply off. From the animations, to input lag, to sound design, the game feels unfinished and unpolished, and games like this rely mightily on their polish to engross the player in their worlds. It's an almost insurmountable problem with the game. Graphics and levels. The other big problem with Tomb Raider is a combination of two smaller things. The first two games were a giant step forward levels of gorgeous. On PC especially, the last game was just stunning to look at, and that was important because you ended up spending a good amount of time just wandering densely packed levels finding shit. Something about the new game just looks worse. It seems muddy and choppy with levels that are strangely too dense for the eyes. Things are frustrating to find and everything feels crammed into spaces that are too small. Nothing feels real here. The last game had a flow. You had a couple of very wide open hub areas that naturally funneled you into smaller, more linear levels. It all felt like roaming a real place. You'd have some randomly generating enemies in these levels and some fun exploration and platforming. And connecting off of these areas, you'd have several more linear spoke levels. It gave the game a real feeling of progress. Level design was in the vein of Dark Souls. Hub areas with spiraling out connecting areas, with secrets hidden through clever little exploration puzzles. A good amount of the fun was seeing something and trying to figure out exactly how to get up to it. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider's level design, like almost every other aspect of the game, it's the same but worse. The areas are very small, and exploration is more frustrating than rewarding. Lara's imprecise jumps, the weird feeling of claustrophobia in these levels, and the total lack of any combat means all these areas feel dead and empty, less like places than like game levels. You have two hub areas this time around, except one is fairly small, and one is perhaps the most annoying level in franchise history. The first hub area you'll reach is a good example of Crystal Dynamics' laudable but silly efforts to somehow make this game culturally sensitive and realistic. I'll briefly touch on what is, in aggregate, a failed story at the end of this video, but here I simply want to talk about the levels and the purpose they serve. The first small hub area you'll come to is the town of Kulak Yaku, where, for some reason, you'll have to walk around talking to people and are suddenly given light dialogue options. Here's the thing, developers. If you're going to give me a deep, fleshed out, and meaningful dialogue system as a way to push a complex narrative through branching possibilities, do it up, man. If you're going to give it to me as a way to foster a connection with other characters, I am in. If you're going to do it to say in the back of your box that you've done it, don't waste your time and resources. What purpose does this serve in this game? Why is this even needed? We're not playing a deep narrative experience here. The fact that Tomb Raider was more gameplay focused is what separates it from the narratively far superior Uncharted series. None of your dialogue options amount to very much. It adds nothing but extra time in menus, and this game already feels like it's wasting my time pretty often. Which brings us to the problem with exploration, which especially rears its head in the game's largest ever hub area, the Hidden City. This area is so fucking annoying. To me. I understand if you like it. I like the idea of liking it, but holy shit, dude, this place is a nightmare to traverse. It very well might be larger than all the other areas in the game combined, and it has no combat, a ton of pointless dialogue, and a map that's so annoying and dense it drives me crazy. It is one thing for Lara to not be able to get to an item because you need to find a sheer cliff to scale. It's another when she can't hop over a bush or a 2-foot fence because despite her superhuman climbing ability, certain tiny obstacles are an insurmountable force field because now the game said so. This area perfectly sums up most of the issues I have with the game. I can only assume this area was made a thriving, living city of people to talk to rather than ruins to explore, fight in, and loot, because Crystal Dynamics wanted to fight back against some of the criticism they've received for the colonialism of Lara Croft, so let's go over this again. I am a radical dude. I believe in near total personal liberty. I think anything you do that doesn't directly hurt another should be legal. I am for equality and tolerance for everybody. I am skeptical of America's intention and overall goodness in foreign policy. I am a liberal libertarian, so I generally agree with political critiques of games that come from the left. I agreed that Far Cry 5 was absurd in its desire to not want to comment on America in a game they wanted to set in America. I made a whole video about it. I agree that the old Lara Croft character model was sexist and ridiculous, but the colonialism critiques of the last two games don't make sense to me. The previous two games took place in Japan and Russia, respectively. The only thing Japan knows of colonialism is its own outrageously brutal actions in Asia from 1900 to 1945. Likewise, Russia has a 1,000-year history of dominating its smaller neighbors and repressing other peoples, forcing them into a pan-Russian empire. These were not peoples hurt by colonialism, and thus those critiques were stupid. Now, this game is set in South and Central America, which were nearly genocidally devastated by European colonialism, so perhaps it's to be expected that they tried to deal with this in the game. But they failed badly, both narratively, where the anti-colonialism message lasts about 45 seconds, and in gameplay, where they decided to take 50% of the gameplay space and devote it to talking to a mythical people and walking around picking shit up instead of shooting things and big action set pieces. This area is just too fucking big, with way too fucking little in it. Most of your time is spent frustratingly backtracking or pulling up the nearly useless map. The conversations you have are completely inane. They're also ridiculous because they speak in English. There's an absurd narrative reason for that that's pointless to even discuss. Or you can make it so they speak an authentic native language, which is pretty cool, but also ridiculous because Lara talks to them in English. So you will ask a question in English. They will perfectly understand and respond in Paititan. So many problems here. Exploration is very frustrating in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and the lack of an anytime fast travel system is just so annoying. I repeatedly got trapped in places that I couldn't get out of, and just wanted to fucking fast travel out. But no, the game simply refuses to let you. If you exit out, you'll be brought right back where you were, meaning you have to spend 20 or 30 minutes wandering around over and over and over until you finally stumble on the terribly signposted spot the game insists you need to go to progress. I don't know exactly what the special sauce was that made the exploration so fun in the last two games and so annoying here, other than that these levels feeling over-designed and unintuitive to traverse. It's another side of the game feel thing. hard to describe but easy to recognize when you're playing. The narrative? Man, there's not much to say here, really. The story of this game is fine. Lara and Noah have some really good character moments together. The big bad has some good moments and is well acted. As in all the games, the main character's dialogue is above average. The acting is of a very high quality. The plot is decently interesting. It is a perfectly decent video game story. But I don't really play video games for stories unless they are really, really good fucking stories. Lara has apparently spent the year or years in between the last game and this hunting down and murdering Trinity agents, which is pretty dark and somewhat hard to believe, but that's fine. The game tries to make this a story about Lara's need to always be involved in a crisis. She can't let the fact that Trinity killed her father go, and so she's been on a crusade bringing her puppy Noah along with her. He occasionally mildly scolds her for the risks she's putting them both through, but only for a second before doing whatever she asks. There is an interesting moment right at the start of the game where Lara loots a dagger that causes the apocalypse to begin. And there's the possibility of a very good story about the uses of power and the danger of thinking that you are right, as well as a kind of cool meta story about player agency in video games. But the story is quite rushed. This is why it's very hard to do a really good story in a game unless A, your game is going to be over 100 hours long, or B, it's going to spend a tremendous amount of time in cutscenes and dialogue. Tomb Raider wants to have the length and gameplay time of a third-person action title, but also the gravitas and narrative weight of a big RPG or narrative-focused game, and so it ends up doing neither really well. The story is far too big for what the game is able to deliver. There simply isn't enough time to cover everything this game seems to want to cover. A main character dies near the 3/4 mark, but what the game thinks is going to be a wrenching, dramatic moment had me go, oh, they died. Oh, okay. If you want death to matter to the player, it takes time and effort. We need to really care about a character. Choosing who you were going to save in Mass Effect 1 was powerful because we'd spent dozens and dozens of hours with those characters. This time, the character in question appeared in a few cutscenes and was trying to win a rebellion we knew nothing about, to complete a ritual we know nothing about, to accomplish a goal we will never know anything about. The game concludes with perhaps the very worst boss fight I have ever played to stop a ritual that will have consequences I know nothing about, and then Lara makes a non-sacrifice. Man, I won't spoil it in case you want to play this thing, but if you finish this game, you'll see what I mean. I don't understand what would have happened if the other guy won, and I don't know what happened because I won. The stakes are never clear. The last game, you were fighting to stop Trinity from getting the ability to literally create an army of immortal soldiers. This time you're fighting to stop them from getting a nebulous power to remake the world. What does that mean? The world does kind of need a bit of remaking, by the way, so yeah, Team Trinity, I guess? Wrapping up. Alright, I just gave you 11 typewritten pages of bitching about this game, so you'd assume I think it's the worst thing ever, but I don't. It's fine, I guess. It's an average video game in my opinion, and far, far less fun and interesting than the first two. It seems to have had about the same development schedule as the first two Reboot games, but something seems to have gone very wrong here. I've seen a bunch of glowing reviews that I simply don't understand. I'm playing AC Odyssey, and I can also assure you that that game isn't nearly as good as the reviews it's gotten as well. It seems some people just want to like some games. And I wanted to like this game. I absolutely love the first two, even with some of the same flaws, but something here is just off. Everything it does, it did better in the last two games. This feels like it should have been the first of the reboots. It feels sloppy and unpolished. It feels like a bunch of ideas are crammed in with no justification. It just feels off. It feels out of balance. I was hoping for this to be one of my stealth favorite games of the year, but no, it's fine. I am rebelling against people rebelling against giving scores, so I will score this shit. It's a 5. It is a perfectly average video game. When the price falls to $30 and you have nothing else to play, it'll be worth your time. In fact, now that it's been long enough, you would be better served just replaying the last game, while you wait for this to drop to a price that better reflects its overall value. Alright, I'm still playing the ridiculously overlong AC Odyssey. I'm waiting to be disappointed by Fallout 76, and I'm finished writing my Dead Space anniversary video, and that will be up in the next week or so. Thanks for coming, see you next time, bye.